Here we go. Another episode of Change of Pace Sports with alternative views. I'm your host, MCKC. On this very special episode, we're going to break down the truth about what happened to the 2021-2022 LA Lakers. Now, the Los Angeles Lakers came into the 2021-22 season with very high expectations, NBA championship aspirations, and they fell far short of those goals and hopes. So on this episode of Change of Pace Sports, we're going to give a little bit of an alternative view to what the mainstream media is saying actually happened to the 2022 LA Lakers. Now, a lot of LA Laker fans were very heated. They're a very passionate group. The Lakers are a very strong brand across the world and across the basketball hemisphere. And when they're not playing well or they're not in championship contention, it definitely resonates. And they do have one of the biggest stars of basketball of the last 20 years on their team in the legendary LeBron James. So now I'm going to go ahead and now give you the truth about what went wrong with the 2022 LA Lakers. Now, first off, the Lakers came into these major expectations of this season by adding Hall of Fame star point guard Russell Westbrook in a trade with the Washington Wizards, giving up players Kyle Kuzma, Caldwell Pope to the Washington Wizards. Now, they also signed legendary scorer Carmelo Anthony to join with perennial all-star Anthony Davis and the legendary aforementioned LeBron James. Now, these four players were also named to the NBA 75, which would be the top 75 players in NBA history in the 75th anniversary of the NBA. But the Lakers went troubling 33-49, and they missed the playoffs after being in playoff contention for much of the season, majority of the season, only falling out of the playoffs basically in the last month of the season. So let's go over now what went wrong with the 2022 LA Lakers. It breaks down to actually three things. Only three things that really happened, and they're not about Russell Westbrook. Now, we've had the media point out as Russell Westbrook was the problem. He was a bad fit. If they had went after a point guard like John Wall instead of Russell Westbrook, they would be better off. If they had kept somebody like Alex Caruso or went after Lonzo Ball, it would have been a better fit. But we're going to actually break that down, and it really wasn't so much of Russell Westbrook as much as the team just had a bad season. But let's go ahead and break down exactly what went wrong with the 2022 Los Angeles Lakers. Reason number one. This is the biggest thing that actually hurt the Lakers of 2022, and it was injuries. Now, if you have a healthy season and all your players are able to play 80% or better of the games, then you could really criticize whether or not they just wasn't a good fit together, or they wasn't a good team in general and they didn't have good players. But the fact of the truth is, we have stat number one. The projected starting lineup of the 2022 LA Lakers missed a total of 173 games. To give you a comparison, the Phoenix Suns, who had the best record in the NBA, their starting lineup had a total of 70 games missing. And that's with Chris Paul missing some time, Devin Booker missing some time, DeAndre Ayton missing some time. They only had a total of 70 games missing from their starting lineup, while the Lakers had well over close to 3 times the amount with 173 games missing. And of those, you had Anthony Davis, who's virtually their best player. He missed 42 out of the 82 games, only played in 40 games. And LeBron James missed 26 games out of the season, which is close to a quarter, a little bit more than a quarter of the season LeBron James missed. So your two best players missed well over a quarter and about half of the season. Injury, big reason number two, you had a big free agent signee was Kendrick Nunn. He never played all season for the Lakers. He was going to be virtually their sixth man. He would come off the bench. He averaged about 15 points. He would have been something like the Jordan Clarkson for the Los Angeles Lakers this year. He was unable to play this year because of an injury that never got right, and that signing never was able to materialize for the Los Angeles Lakers this year. And then to even prove this more about how bad injuries hurt the 2022 Los Angeles Lakers, they were the only team in the NBA that did not have a single five-man lineup that played at least 100 minutes together. Let that stat sink in. So injuries was the biggest thing that torpedoed the 2022 LA Lakers season. Now we go into reason number 2, and this is the reason that the coach was actually fired. Reason number 2 is actually coaching. I do have some history in coaching myself. I'm an AAU coach. But to say that Frank Vogel wasn't the problem and it was the players, I'm going to have to explain why Frank Vogel eventually has a huge part to blame for the 2022 Los Angeles Lakers. Now, Frank Vogel's actual specialty is defense. He's a defensive-minded coach. He's an elite defensive-minded coach. And what the Lakers slipped on the most this season was their defense. The Lakers in 2021 were first in defensive rating. They were second in opponent points per game. They were fifth in opponent's effective field goal percentage. Those are top 5 marks in all of the main categories for defense. The Lakers were the elite defensive team next to the New York Knicks last season. Now in 2022, those numbers dropped to 21st in defensive rating, 28th in opponent's points per game, and 21st in opponent's effective field goal percentage. Now those precipitous drops cannot be attributed so much to the personnel. They had personnel that still should have been able to maintain at least a top half of the league, a top 15 defensive rating, and they were unable to do that. That falls definitively on Frank Vogel as the head coach. And as we go into the coaching as a reason, a big part of why they were unable to maintain the same level of defensive efficiency from the coaching staff is the loss of Jason Kidd. Jason Kidd was the associate head coach for the Los Angeles Lakers last year, and just to show you some of the effects that he has on defense with the teams that he's coaching, the team that he took over was the Dallas Mavericks. He became the head coach of the Dallas Mavericks in 2022. The Dallas Mavericks in 2021 were 20th in defensive rating, 9th in opponents' points per game, and 10th in opponents' effective field goal percentage. In 2022, in their first year under Jason Kidd as head coach, they improved 14 positions to go 6th in defensive rating this year, 2nd in opponents' points per game, and 8th in opponents' effective field goal percentage. So they improved in all of their major defensive categories and significantly in defensive rating in just 1 year with Jason Kidd, and their personnel didn't change that greatly. So again, that's a big reason why the Lakers defensively took a step back, and as a team took a step back. And that's directly to the coaching side of things, why unfortunately Frank Vogel was fired at the end of the season because of the debacle season the Lakers had. Lastly, what we have to point to for Frank Vogel's coaching errors, he didn't make a lot of good adaptations or adjustments as the season went along. First thing we could point to as a poor adjustment, the Lakers ranked 4th in pace in the entire NBA, but the Lakers have the oldest team in the NBA. They have an average age of 30.2, which ranks as the oldest age in the NBA, but yet they were 4th in pace. That is something that wouldn't make sense, and that could be a reason why they were so injured throughout the year. They shouldn't have been playing at such a high pace with players that are so old. Number 2, with the adjustments, he never got a career best of any of his players. That's a sure sign that a coach wasn't able to affect his players and be able to put them in the best positions. When none of your players are able to have a career season, that shows you that you wasn't actually able to affect your players and put them in the best positions 1 through 12 in that season. And then number 3, which is another knock on Frank Vogel, the Lakers had the NBA leading high 41 different starting lineups in the 2022 season. That is basically a different starting lineup every other game. And that's a coaching thing. You have to build stability and chemistry with your team, and Frank Vogel was unable to do that the entire season, regardless of injuries. So that was the second major reason that the 2022 Lakers were unable to reach the high expectations. It was coaching. Partly Frank Vogel, partly the loss of Jason Kidd. Now the last reason for why the Lakers actually struggled in 2022 was actually their roster construction. Now the media did hit on this quite a bit, as they said the Lakers had a poorly fit team, but it wasn't so much of a poorly fit as they didn't have the proper depth. They had decent players. They had a good team. They had good players. But again, they didn't have good depth for what the things that they were missing or for what their coach is good at. Frank Vogel is good at defense, they brought in a lot of offensive savvy players like a Malik Monk. He's more of an offensive talent. He's not as much as a defensive talent. Okay, so we're going to start off with roster construction issue number 1. The Lakers were the oldest team in the NBA. The average age was 30.2. That's actually it's not good. The Lakers weren't coming off of a championship, so to put out a team that old and not sprinkle in enough youth to even it out, that's a poor job on the general manager and the roster construction. And that showed by the way that team was very injured, and they didn't have enough players to be able to go out there and run the sets and run the kind of defense that Frank Vogel wanted to play. And a big part of that is in number 2. The Lakers being unable to retain and re-sign player Alex Caruso. Alex Caruso is one of the best role players and best defensive players in the NBA this season, and he brought that to the Lakers. The Lakers developed Alex Caruso over the years. He was a big part of their bench during their championship season in the bubble, and to not re-sign Alex Caruso was a big mistake by the GM Rob Pelinka, and we saw Alex Caruso have a very good season for the Chicago Bulls and help them, after several years of not being in the playoffs, get into the playoffs. So that was a major mistake for the roster construction, not bringing back Alex Caruso. And then lastly, reason number 3 of the poor roster construction was failing to sign a more reliable 3-and-D veteran. Now, they did go out and get Trevor Ariza, but Trevor Ariza was coming off of an injury-riddled season in 2021, and we wasn't sure if he was even going to retire or play in 2022. And he struggled to get on the court because of various injuries and health concerns. So to bring in a more reliable 3-and-D, they had a choice of going after players like Nick Batum, who eventually re-signed with the Los Angeles Clippers. You had Reggie Bullock, who eventually signed with the Dallas Mavericks, and actually was a huge part of why their defense went from a 20th rating in 2021 to 6th in 2022. And then number 3, who was also part of the Lakers during their championship season, Danny Green, who re-signed with the Philadelphia 76ers, was another player that could have been an excellent pickup to help out the loss of a Caldwell Pope in the trade for Russell Westbrook. So I think GM Rob Pelinka didn't do well in the offseason, even though the Lakers coming out of the offseason was rated very high by a lot of media players. A lot of people gave them high grades, B's and A- for their offseason. So because again, the addition of Kendrick Nunn, Carmelo Anthony, and Russell Westbrook, and bringing back Dwight Howard, those looked great. If everybody's healthy this year, the Lakers should probably be a top 4 seed in the West. But everybody wasn't healthy, and it showed, and they eventually fell out the playoff contention to the point where they didn't even make the playoffs this year. But to say that this was a horrible year for the Lakers and the Lakers had a horrible team, that is not the case. They did have some good young talent, but unfortunately, again, Kendrick Nunn not playing really hurt what the Lakers had going on, and Anthony Davis basically not being able to be there, being basically a part-time player, only playing 40 games this year. That significantly hurt the Lakers. If Anthony Davis plays 70 or more games, the Lakers are at least a 7th seed or a 6th seed in the Western Conference this season. So what the media wants to give you is that happened was the Russell Westbrook trade was a bad trade. It was not. It was a fine trade. LeBron James and Russell Westbrook, they would have been good on the court together in the playoffs. In the regular season, you didn't get a chance to really see them build the chemistry they needed to actually be very effective with each other. I've heard a lot of media pundits say that it's because of Anthony Davis' regression as a star. That's also false. While Anthony Davis on the court, he was still one of the best 15 to 20 players in the NBA. But unfortunately, again, Anthony Davis has struggled with injury concerns his entire career rather. And this was just another year in which he struggled with injuries, and it played out where the Lakers had a season in which we've seen from the New Orleans Pelicans several years when Anthony Davis was unable to be healthy for at least 70 to 80% of the games played. So that's me again, Change of Pace Sports, your guy MCKC. If you have any disputes, if you want to argue out some of my points, if you feel like I was wrong on some of these points, you go ahead and you can leave that in a comment. I definitely will answer back. I definitely will argue back. And thanks for viewing. If you like this kind of content, I will continue to provide it on a weekly basis. This again is Change of Pace Sports. I'm your host, MCKC, and peace.